You think you're the voice in your head, that constant narrator, that relentless commentator, analyzing, judging, remembering, planning. You've been conditioned to believe that this voice is you, that this is what consciousness means, that the boundary of your skull contains the totality of your being. But what if I told you that everything you've been taught about your identity is a neurological illusion, a construct generated by specific brain regions that fire in predictable patterns, and that mystics figured this out 800 years ago while neuroscientists are only now catching up? What if the person you think you are doesn't actually exist, and faith, real faith, the kind that transcends belief systems and enters the realm of direct experience, physically dismantles the architecture of this illusion inside your brain? This isn't philosophy. This isn't poetry. This is measurable, observable, replicable neuroscience colliding with the mystical insights of a 13th century Sufi master named Ibn Arabi, who described the dissolution of the self and the unity of all existence, centuries before we had fMRI machines to prove he was describing actual brain states. And if what he said is true, if what the neuroscience now confirms is accurate, then most of you are living inside a prison you don't even know exists, a cage built by evolution and reinforced by culture, and the door has been open this entire time. But here's the disturbing part. Opening that door requires you to let something die, not metaphorically, physically, neurologically. And most people would rather suffer in the familiar hell of their own mind than face what lies beyond the dissolution of the self they've spent their entire lives defending. So if you're comfortable in your suffering, if you've made peace with your anxiety, your restlessness, your perpetual sense of separation from everything around you, this video is not for you. But if something in you suspects that there's a way out, that there's a state of being where the boundary between self and world becomes translucent, where consciousness expands beyond the confines of your personal history, then stay with me. Because what we're about to explore will rewire not just how you think about faith or spirituality, but how your brain physically constructs reality itself. 8 centuries ago in Andalusia, a man named Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi walked through the world perceiving something radically different from what most humans see. Where you see separation, distinct objects, clear boundaries between self and other, Ibn Arabi perceived wahdat al-wujud, the unity of being, the singular existence expressing itself through infinite forms. This wasn't a belief he adopted. This was a direct perception, a lived experience of reality that consumed him completely. He described the cosmos as a mirror, consciousness as the reflecting surface, and God as both the observer and the observed, collapsing the subject-object duality that structures ordinary human experience. In his most radical claim, Ibn Arabi stated that wujud, existence itself, is identical to consciousness, to awareness, to the act of finding and being found. There is no separation between the one who perceives and that which is perceived. All boundaries, all divisions, all the separate selves you encounter, including your own, are imaginal realities, not illusions exactly, but realities of a different order, existing in the barzakh, the isthmus between absolute unity and material multiplicity. You are not a separate consciousness observing the world. You are the world becoming conscious of itself through the aperture of a human nervous system. Now you might dismiss this as mystical poetry, the kind of abstract spirituality that sounds profound but means nothing concrete. Except neuroscience has accidentally stumbled into the same territory, and what they've found is deeply unsettling. Because when researchers put long-term meditators, contemplatives, people engaged in serious spiritual practice into brain scanners, they discovered something that shouldn't be possible according to our standard model of selfhood. These individuals can voluntarily alter the functioning of their default mode network, the constellation of brain regions responsible for generating your sense of self. The default mode network, DMN, is your ego's command center. It includes the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the inferior parietal lobule, regions that integrate information from across your brain to construct the narrative of you. This is where your autobiographical memory lives, where you plan for the future, where you ruminate about past conversations, where you distinguish yourself from others. This network is most active when you're doing nothing, when you're just sitting there, lost in thought, mind wandering. experiencing what you think of as your default state of consciousness. But here's what Ibn Arabi understood, and what neuroscience now confirms. This default state is not your true nature. It's a construction, a habitual pattern of neural firing that creates the illusion of a separate, continuous self moving through time. And spiritual practices, real ones, the kind that demand discipline and surrender, don't strengthen this network. They systematically dismantle it. When experienced meditators enter deep states of contemplation, their default mode network activity decreases dramatically. The chatter quiets, the narrator steps back, and what emerges is a state of consciousness characterized by unity, timelessness, spacelessness, a dissolution of the boundary between observer and observed. This is not a metaphor. This is a measurable change in brain function, the feeling of being a separate self located behind your eyes. Looking out at a world of objects, that feeling has a neural signature, and it can be turned down, even temporarily switched off. Ibn Arabi called this the station of no station, the state where all limited spiritual attainments are transcended and integrated into a supreme realization of divine oneness. Modern neuroscientists call it ego dissolution, transient hypofrontality, or non-dual awareness. Different languages describing the same neurological event, the temporary suspension of the brain's self-referential processing. And this is where it gets psychologically disturbing. Because if your sense of self, your ego, your identity, is just a pattern of neural activity that can be voluntarily reduced, then what are you defending? What are you protecting when you resist change, when you cling to your beliefs, your wounds, your story about who you are and what happened to you? You're defending a neurological habit, a feedback loop that your brain has reinforced through repetition until it feels like the foundation of reality itself. But it's not the foundation. It's a filter. And faith, the kind Ibn Arabi embodied, the kind that neuroscience now validates, is the process of systematically dissolving that filter. Let's be clear about what faith means in this context, because the word has been degraded by centuries of institutional religion. Faith is not belief without evidence. Faith is not accepting propositions you can't verify. Faith, in the mystical and neurological sense, is the sustained practice of directing attention in ways that restructure the brain's habitual patterns of self-construction. It's the willingness to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, to surrender the compulsive need to narrate and control, to allow the default mode network to quiet so that other modes of consciousness can emerge. This is why prayer works. Not because an external deity intervenes, though that's one valid interpretive framework, but because repetitive, focused, emotionally engaged prayer physically alters brain structure. When you pray with genuine devotion, when you meditate with disciplined attention, you are engaging in a form of neurological self-modification. You are rewiring the circuits that generate your sense of self, weakening the neural pathways that reinforce separation, and strengthening the pathways that facilitate unity, compassion, and transcendence. Studies on long-term meditators show increased cortical thickness in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for attention and emotional regulation. They show increased gray matter density in the hippocampus, critical for memory and emotional processing. They show reduced reactivity in the amygdala, the brain's fear center, meaning these individuals are literally less afraid, less reactive to perceived threats. And perhaps most significantly, they show sustained gamma wave synchrony during practice, high-frequency oscillations across distant brain regions, indicating a level of neural integration that doesn't occur in ordinary consciousness. This is neuroplasticity in action, the brain's ability to reorganize itself based on experience. And here's the critical insight that Ibn Arabi grasped intuitively, and that neuroscience has now confirmed empirically. You can choose which version of yourself to reinforce. Every thought you think, every emotion you indulge, every pattern of attention you repeat, you are voting for a particular neural configuration, strengthening some pathways, allowing others to atrophy. Most people don't choose. They default. They allow the cultural conditioning, the trauma responses, the evolutionary fear circuits to run on autopilot, and then they wonder why they feel trapped, why nothing changes, why they can't escape the patterns that have defined their entire lives. They mistake their default mode for their destiny, but Ibn Arabi offers a different model, and neuroscience accidentally validates it. He proposed that the human being is a microcosm, a perfect image of the divine totality, containing all the divine names and attributes in potentiality. But most people never realize this potential because they remain identified with the surface level of existence, the realm of multiplicity and separation, never penetrating to the depths where unity resides. The spiritual path, according to Ibn Arabi, is the process of polishing the mirror of the heart, removing the layers of dust, ego, attachment, fear, so that consciousness can reflect reality as it truly is, unified, singular, infinite. And the method for polishing this mirror is consistent, disciplined attention directed toward the divine, however you conceptualize it. Now translate this into neurological terms. The mirror is your conscious awareness. The dust is the habitual activation of the default mode network, the constant self-referential chatter. The polishing is the practice of meditation, prayer, contemplation, any discipline that trains attention and reduces ego-driven mental activity. And the reflection, the clear perception of unity. That's what happens when the default mode network quiets and other neural networks come online, networks associated with present moment awareness, with empathy, with the direct perception of interconnection. Ibn Arabi described stages in this process. He talked about the state of wajd, ecstatic finding, a temporary aperture through which the divine breaks into ordinary consciousness. This corresponds to what neuroscientists observe in novice meditators, brief moments when the default mode network is disrupted, producing feelings of awe, transcendence, connection. But these moments are unstable, fleeting, dependent on external conditions. Then there's wujud, a more stable state where the awareness of the real becomes permanent, integrated into the structure of consciousness itself. This corresponds to the brain changes seen in long-term practitioners, the structural alterations that make non-dual awareness more accessible, less effortful. It's not that the ego disappears permanently, but that the practitioner develops the neurological flexibility to move between egoic and non-egoic modes of consciousness at will. And finally, there's the station of no station, the complete integration where even the distinction between self and other, between finding and being found, dissolves into pure awareness. This is what the most advanced practitioners report, and it correlates with dramatic changes in brain function, sustained alterations in how consciousness itself is generated and experienced. But here's the part that most spiritual seekers don't want to hear, and this is where the darkness comes in. This process is not comfortable. It's not blissful. It's not about feeling good. The dissolution of the ego, the weakening of the default mode network, feels like dying because in a very real sense, you are dying. The person you've been your entire life, the one you've defended and promoted and identified with, that person has to be sacrificed for something else to emerge. Ibn Arabi talked about fana, annihilation, the complete extinction of the individual self in the divine presence. This is not a metaphor. Psychologically, neurologically, this is the experience of your self-referential processing shutting down, and it's terrifying. Every survival instinct you have, every evolutionary program designed to maintain your individual existence, screams in protest. Your brain interprets the dissolution of the ego as a mortal threat, because as far as your nervous system is concerned, it is. This is why so many people start meditation and quit. This is why spiritual practice feels destabilizing before it feels liberating. You're not transcending to some higher realm. You're deconstructing the only reality you've ever known, and there's no guarantee that what replaces it will be better. There's just the promise made by mystics across cultures and now tentatively supported by neuroscience that on the other side of this dissolution, there's a form of consciousness that is freer, more expansive, less dominated by fear and craving. But you have to go through the death to get there. You have to be willing to sit in the discomfort as your brain rewires itself, as old patterns weaken and new ones haven't yet solidified. This is the dark night of the soul, the existential crisis that every serious practitioner encounters, the moment when the old self is dying and the new self hasn't yet been born. And most people turn back. They return to their old patterns, their old identities, their old suffering because at least it's familiar. At least they know who they are inside their cage, even if it's unbearable. Ibn Arabi didn't turn back. He walked all the way through, and what he found on the other side was a reality so radically different from ordinary perception that he spent the rest of his life trying to articulate it. He wrote hundreds of books, thousands of pages, attempting to map the territory of unified consciousness for those still trapped in the illusion of separation. And what's remarkable is how consistent his descriptions are with what neuroscience is now discovering. He described the imaginal realm, the alam al-mithal, an intermediate world between pure spirit and gross matter, where consciousness takes form. This sounds like mystical fantasy until you realize he's describing exactly what the brain does. It generates representations, models, simulations that mediate between raw sensory data and conscious experience. You never perceive the world directly. You perceive your brain's model of the world, constructed in real time from incomplete information. And this model, this imaginal construct, is shaped by the patterns of attention you've reinforced throughout your life. If you've spent decades reinforcing fear-based, ego-driven, separation-based patterns, your brain will generate an imaginal world of threat, scarcity, isolation. If you've spent decades reinforcing practices of compassion, presence, and unity, your brain will generate a very different imaginal reality. This is the power and the terror of neuroplasticity. Your consciousness is not fixed. Reality as you experience it is not fixed. Both are contingent on the neural architecture you've built through repetition and attention. And faith, true faith, is the decision to build a different architecture even when every instinct you have is screaming at you to stay the same. Ibn Arabi understood that the divine names, the infinite attributes of God, are not external qualities to be observed, but potentials to be realized within consciousness itself. Every human being contains the full spectrum of divine attributes in seed form, but most never cultivate them. They remain trapped in a narrow bandwidth of consciousness, expressing only a fraction of their neurological and spiritual potential. The spiritual path, then, is a process of activation, of bringing latent neural networks online through disciplined practice. When you practice compassion, you're not just being a good person. You're strengthening the neural circuitry associated with empathy and connection. When you practice presence, you're not just being mindful. You're weakening the default mode network's grip on your consciousness. When you practice surrender, you're not just letting go emotionally. You're training your brain to reduce its constant need for control and prediction. Every practice is a neurological intervention. Every moment of attention is a vote for a particular configuration of consciousness. And over time, with consistency, these small interventions accumulate into structural changes that alter the fundamental nature of your experience. But here's the catch. You can't fake this. You can't think your way into it. Ibn Arabi was explicit about this. Intellectual knowledge, the kind you acquire through reading and reasoning, is not the same as experiential knowledge, the kind that arises from direct encounter with the real. You can read every book on mysticism and neuroscience ever written and remain completely unchanged because reading doesn't rewire your brain. Practice does. This is why Ibn Arabi emphasized the necessity of spiritual discipline, of consistent, devoted practice over years and decades. Not because God demands it, but because the brain requires repetition to reorganize itself. Neuroplasticity is not magic. It's a biological process governed by the principle of Hebbian learning. Neurons that fire together wire together. If you want to weaken the neural pathways that generate anxiety, you have to stop activating them and start activating different pathways. If you want to strengthen the neural networks that generate peace, connection, transcendence, you have to practice the mental and emotional states associated with those networks consistently over time. There's no shortcut. There's no hack. There's just the patient, often uncomfortable work of sitting with your own mind, observing its patterns, and choosing moment by moment to direct attention in ways that serve your transformation rather than your stagnation. And this is where most people fail, not because they lack intelligence or desire, but because they lack the willingness to endure the intermediate stage, the phase where the old self is weakening but the new self hasn't yet stabilized. This phase is psychologically brutal. You're too conscious to go back to your old patterns. but not yet integrated enough to rest in the new ones. You're in the barzakh, the liminal space between two modes of being, and it feels like falling. Ibn Arabi would say this is exactly where you need to be. This discomfort, this disorientation, is the sign that transformation is occurring. The ego doesn't die quietly. It fights. It generates anxiety, doubt, existential dread, anything to convince you to return to the familiar prison of self-referential thought. But if you can stay with it, if you can continue the practice even when it feels pointless, even when nothing seems to be happening, the brain will eventually reorganize around the new patterns you're reinforcing. This is faith, not belief in a doctrine, but trust in the process of transformation, even when you can't see the results yet. It's the willingness to keep practicing when every rational part of your mind is telling you to quit. And what neuroscience has discovered, somewhat reluctantly, is that this kind of faith has measurable effects. People who engage in consistent spiritual practice don't just report feeling better. They show objective improvements in emotional regulation, stress resilience, cognitive flexibility, and even physical health. Their brains are literally different from those of non-practitioners, not because they were born different, but because they chose to engage in the disciplines that reshape neural architecture. Ibn Arabi called this the path of the perfect human, the insan al-kamil, the individual who has realized the full spectrum of divine attributes within themselves. Not a superhuman, but a fully human being, someone who has integrated all the fragmented aspects of consciousness into a coherent, unified whole, and the method he prescribed, consistent contemplation, surrender, and the cultivation of divine attributes, maps precisely onto what neuroscience now recommends for optimal brain function and psychological well-being. But Ibn Arabi went further than modern neuroscience is willing to go, at least publicly. He claimed that the ultimate realization is not just psychological health or emotional balance, but the direct perception of wahdat al-wujud, the recognition that all existence is a single, unified reality expressing itself through infinite forms, that you are not a fragment of consciousness observing the universe, but the universe becoming conscious of itself through the temporary aperture of your nervous system. This is where mysticism and materialism diverge. Neuroscience can show you the brain states associated with this perception, the reduced default mode network activity, the increased gamma synchrony, the altered connectivity patterns. But neuroscience cannot tell you whether the perception is true, whether the universe really is a unified field of consciousness, or whether mystics are simply experiencing a particularly compelling neurological illusion. Ibn Arabi would say that the question itself is misguided, that truth is not a proposition to be verified externally, but a reality to be inhabited experientially. You cannot think your way into understanding whether consciousness is fundamental or emergent. You can only practice your way into the state where the question dissolves because the distinction between self and world, between observer and observed, no longer operates. And here's the existential edge that cuts through all the spiritual bypassing, all the pseudo-mystical nonsense that floods contemporary discourse. If Ibn Arabi is right, if the neuroscience is pointing in the direction he described 8 centuries ago, then the way you're currently living is a form of voluntary blindness. You have the capacity right now to begin the process of rewiring your brain, of weakening the neural circuits that generate suffering, of strengthening the circuits that facilitate peace, connection, transcendence. But you won't. Most of you won't. Because it requires something you're not willing to give: consistency, discipline, the surrender of the very identity you've spent your entire life constructing. It's easier to read about mysticism than to practice it. It's easier to talk about neuroplasticity than to sit in meditation for an hour every day for years. It's easier to remain trapped in your suffering than to do the uncomfortable work of transformation. And that's fine. That's your choice. But don't pretend you don't have a choice. Don't pretend you're stuck, that change is impossible, that you're a victim of your brain chemistry or your past or your circumstances. The neuroscience is clear. The brain can change. Consciousness can change. You can change, but only if you're willing to die first. Not a physical death, a psychological death, the death of the person you think you are, the dissolution of the ego structure that has defined your reality for as long as you can remember. And this death is not an event, it's a process. It's the daily practice of choosing presence over distraction, surrender over control, connection over isolation. It's the gradual weakening of the default mode network's dominance and the corresponding emergence of other modes of consciousness that evolution didn't prioritize because they don't enhance reproductive fitness, but they do enhance the quality of lived experience. Ibn Arabi described the stages of this death with precision. First, there's the recognition that the self you think you are is a construct, a pattern, not a thing. This recognition is intellectual at first, an idea you hold, not a truth you embody. Then there's the practice, the repetitive training of attention, the disciplined cultivation of states of consciousness that contradict your habitual patterns. This is the long middle phase, the years of practice where nothing seems to be happening, where doubt accumulates, where every instinct tells you to quit. And then, if you persist, there's a shift. Not a dramatic enlightenment experience, though those can occur, but a subtle reorganization, where the new patterns become more stable than the old ones. The default mode network still activates, you still have a sense of self, but it's no longer the only mode available. You can step back from it, observe it, choose whether to identify with it or not. And in those moments of disidentification, something else becomes apparent. A background awareness that was always there but was drowned out by the constant noise of self-referential thought. Ibn Arabi called this the heart, not the physical organ, but the organ of spiritual perception, the capacity to perceive reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Neuroscience doesn't have a good term for it yet, but they're observing it in brain scans, the increased connectivity between regions that normally don't communicate, the integration of hemispheric processing, the simultaneous activation of networks that are usually anti-correlated. This is what rewiring looks like from the inside. It's not a linear progression from suffering to bliss. It's a messy, non-linear process of deconstructing one mode of consciousness and allowing another to emerge, not because the new mode is morally superior, but because it's less constrained, more flexible, more capable of responding to reality as it is, rather than as your trauma and conditioning tell you it must be. And here's the final, most disturbing insight. This process never ends. There's no final state, no permanent enlightenment where you're done and can relax into cosmic bliss. Consciousness is not static. The brain is not static. Every moment is a new opportunity to reinforce old patterns or build new ones. The choice is constant, relentless, exhausting. And the moment you stop choosing, the moment you assume you've arrived, the default mode reasserts itself and you're back where you started. Maybe not completely, but enough to feel the cage closing in again. Ibn Arabi knew this. He talked about the station of no station, the realization that there is no fixed spiritual attainment, only an infinite unfolding of divine self-disclosure. Every moment is a new revelation if you have the capacity to perceive it, and that capacity must be cultivated continuously. The brain doesn't maintain new neural pathways automatically. It maintains the pathways you use. Stop using them and they atrophy. It's that simple and that brutal. So what do you do with this information? You have three options. You can ignore it, continue living in the default mode, reinforcing the same patterns that have defined your life until now, and that's a valid choice. Most people make it. Or you can intellectualize it. Turn it into another interesting idea to think about, another concept to add to your collection, and that's what most people who don't ignore it end up doing. Or you can practice. You can choose a discipline, any discipline, meditation, prayer, contemplation, and commit to it with the understanding that you're not trying to achieve anything, you're trying to die to who you've been, so that something else can emerge. And if you choose the third option, understand what you're committing to. You're committing to years of discomfort, doubt, and destabilization. You're committing to the gradual dissolution of the only identity you've ever known. You're committing to faith not as belief, but as the willingness to keep practicing when there's no evidence it's working, when your rational mind is screaming that it's pointless, when every part of you wants to return to the familiar suffering of your default patterns. But if Ibn Arabi is right, and if the neuroscience that accidentally validates his insights 8 centuries later is correct, then on the other side of that commitment is a mode of consciousness that is freer, more expansive, less dominated by fear and craving, more capable of perceiving the unity that underlies the apparent multiplicity of existence, not as a belief, but as a lived reality, a direct perception enabled by a brain that has been systematically rewired through disciplined practice. The door is open. It's been open the entire time. The question is whether you're willing to walk through it, knowing that the person who walks out the other side won't be the same person who walked in, knowing that this death is not optional, it's the price of transformation. Knowing that faith, real faith, is not comfort or certainty, but the willingness to dissolve into uncertainty with the trust that something real lies beyond the illusion of the separate self. Ibn Arabi walked through. The mystics across every tradition have walked through. The neuroscience suggests it's possible for anyone, but possibility is not the same as probability. Most doors remain closed, not because they're locked, but because no one is willing to turn the handle. The architecture of your consciousness is not fixed. The experience you call reality is contingent on neural patterns you've reinforced through habit and inattention, and faith, understood correctly, is the tool for dismantling those patterns and allowing new ones to form. But tools only work if you use them, and using them requires something most people are not willing to give: the death of who they think they are in exchange for the possibility of who they might become. 800 years ago, Ibn Arabi saw this clearly. Now neuroscience is beginning to see it too. The question is, can you see it? And more importantly, what will you do with what you see? Because seeing changes nothing. Only practice changes the brain. Only faith, the sustained, disciplined, often uncomfortable work of rewiring consciousness, produces transformation. And in the end, that's all any of us have: this moment, this breath, this choice to reinforce the old patterns or build new ones. Ibn Arabi made his choice. Neuroscience has mapped the consequences. Now it's your turn. Will you stay in the cage, or will you walk through the open door knowing that you can't come back as the person you are now? The unity of being is not somewhere else. It's here, obscured by the neural patterns that generate the illusion of separation. And those patterns can change if you have the faith to let them.